Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I want to start on a new series called The British Philosophers, and the first philosopher I want to cover is Sir Francis Bacon. But first, a little background on why the British philosophers. Primarily, this is because Britain, relatively small set of islands there, had a world-spanning empire. And two things happen when you have a world-spanning empire. Is first, regardless of the size of your population, it has a dramatically outsized influence because you go all over the world. Second, because you're all over the world and you seem to know what you're doing, people pay peculiarly close attention to the ideas that you have because they think, oh, these ideas must be really central to the reason they're so powerful and so widespread. And we want to be powerful and widespread and rich. Don't forget rich. So, hey, let's see what they're thinking, what their ideas are, and how they've come to be in this position of dominance. And so the study of and the influence of British philosophy is, dramatically out of proportion to what you would expect by size, land mass of the British Isles or the population of the British Isles. It was the massive spread of the ideas of Britain, and then, of course, through the English language, many of these ideas adopted in the United States, and then this just amplifies the process. So relatively small geographic area, relatively huge world impact. Indeed, until, you had something like this with the impact of Latin, because that allowed the language or ideas to spread within the Latin-speaking community of Europe, which is just a language of the elites. But something similar happened with the British Empire in that when English became the language of the global elites, then the ideas that were originally composed in English and whose history comes from an English language background seem very much more important than, again, they would be if they were in any other language. And so the impact of British philosophers has been surprisingly large, and they have had some really remarkably good ideas. So let's go through that. So number one, where to begin? Let's begin with Sir Francis Bacon. And there's several important reasons why we want to start with him. It's important to remember that the Reformation kicks off and, pick a date, 1520, 1521. I think it was 1521, I think is when they condemned Martin Luther. And they said, okay, those ideas you have about reforming the Catholic Church is officially not in favor of those ideas. We don't want those reforms, and lots kicks off. Most importantly, what had been a sort of integrated global or integrated European-wide agreement about the power and authority of the Catholic Church starts to fragment. And then, of course, Henry VIII, if you're in England, really gets this going when he says, hey, forget you guys. I want to marry somebody else. I want to get a divorce. The Pope won't give it to me. Therefore, I'm going to tell the Pope that he can go pound sand. I don't have to follow the Pope anymore. I am the leader of the church in these in my lands, in my realm, however I conceptualize that. This is a huge break, but it's important to note that this was long running. 10 years earlier, Henry VIII was perfectly content, happy, thought that the Catholic Church was the right, that he should be subject to the rules, seemed only natural and good to him. He was a defender of the faith officially. He was, no one saw him coming as this radical, Martin Luther kind of character, but he turned out to be in some ways at least as radical because he said, no, as a ruler, I am not subject to anyone's authority except for, of course, God, for whom I also speak. And so that fragmented England and the territories controlled by England from this European-wide intellectual, legal, every other kind of way, religious, obviously, system, and sort of set it aside. It started part of the uniqueness of the British thinking process specifically because of that break. So it was no longer an integrated religious or intellectual center or maybe periphery of the European-wide Catholic span. And up until that point, intellectually, Paris, Rome, these places were the centers of study. Sevilla, because they were associated with long histories of church theology. And so this is where you went to learn. This is where you went to study. This is where you got your intellectual ideas and capacities from. Bacon is the first systematic break with that tradition, which means he's the first systematic break with a tradition that had been going on for centuries at this point. And to get a sense of this, you can think of another thinker, Thomas Aquinas, Saint Thomas Aquinas. How do you become a saint? You write the Summa Theologica. And this was an attempt, well, some considered successful, written in the mid-1400s, 1440s, right in there. Well, he wrote it for longer than that. I think it's officially published in the 1440s. I forget. Right in that range. So St. Thomas Aquinas becomes a saint because he writes the Summa Theologica, in which he takes key Bible verses and key passages from Aristotle and Cicero and Dionysius, I think, the other Dionysius. There's two Dionysiuses, the other Dionysius. And he creates a narrative of these truths we hold to be sacred. And the church just loved this. And so his Summa Theologica became like the central text because it used the appeal and authority of the ancients, combined it with Aristotle's sort of logic system, and then applied this to the biblical passages. And so it said, look, the wisdom of the ancient proves that our concepts and the concepts from the Bible are correct. These are true. These are the ideas that we should be holding, and here I prove them. So it was this great combination of the two streams of thought that had been dominating the European world up till that point. The Catholic Church, of course, loving the theology, Renaissance ideas bringing in the ancients. St. Thomas Aquinas steps in to combine them, and you get the sort of perfect medieval, late medieval, post-Renaissance text of this beautiful, seemingly convincing, church certainly enjoyed it, hence St. Thomas Aquinas, concept of the two streams proving that the Pope is good, these truths are self-evident, here's all these proofs of gods, even, I don't know how this makes sense, but even the pagan thinkers who existed before the Christians, of course, recognize and can be incorporated into making these arguments. And that sort of intellectual environment dominated this period. And then along comes Sir Francis Bacon. And it's hard to get a sense of him in his entirety because he did so much. He was a lawyer, he was a counsel for the crown, and then he became chamberlain for the crown. I mean, he did all these jobs for the court. He was involved in all these trials and intrigues. You know, he's in favor, he's out of favor, his brother's in trouble, he's in debt, he's in more debt, and he's in some more debt, his friends are getting killed, armies, monarch is shifting. So behind him, all this stuff is going on. And so he wrote a lot of legal precedents. He wrote a lot of cases for Parliament. He was a member of Parliament, and so he was arguing, trying to get things passed. He worked for the crown. This was his main job, and his main thing was to be a courtier and to try to move up in the hierarchy that way. And so he wrote an immense amount, so most of which we're going to just ignore. We're just going to ignore that. I want to just focus on what is generally considered for intellectual history, and certainly for the history of science, his main text, which is the Novum Organum. And what's crucial about the Novum Organum, I mean, it's hard, like I said, it's hard to get a sense of this if you haven't read, 1,000 or so pages of earlier writings, which are like, take a look at the Summa Theologica online if you're interested, and you'll see how Thomas Aquinas starts this with, we're going to ponder the infinite goodness of God within the context of the greatness of his truth and the truth of his greatness and the infinity of the truth of his greatness, which creates a love that is greater than the truth of the infinity. And it's all this swirl of circular ideas and quotes, and not what we would consider in the contemporary world rigorous. But the conception here is, I'm creating a story, a narrative. I'm using these authorities. I stick them all together. Therefore, argument good. We like the argument. Therefore, correct. Bacon comes along and just completely blows this up. He hates this. He hates everything about it. And he's unbelievably clear. So briefly, I just want to mention, I'm going to read some quotes from him, so hopefully you'll get a sense of this. But I do want to point out that part of his influence, and not a small part, was simply stylistic. Here he steps forward, he writes so clearly relative, it seems confusing, by the way. I'll warn you if you're going to go back and read him. Out of context, you go, oh, this is kind of confusing. Some of this language, I'm not sure. Some of these sentences seem a bit longish. But remember, this was written, let's see, 1600 roughly is when he worked on it for a long time. So I'm just going to pick the date 1600. He wrote a couple of versions of it. So when it was officially published, et cetera, pick your date. But he's writing around the 1600. So 400 years ago, he's writing, and that prose still stands up. If you compare it to other writings of the time, and certainly writings earlier, all of a sudden the clarity of his mind and what he's attempting to do, it just really jumps off the page at you. And so he was influential in part simply because of the way he was trying to organize his thinking, how he was trying to generate clarity. And a lot of those structures, the written structures, the stylistic ideas actually became influential. And you'll see this in other philosophers that we talk about who were influenced by him, like Locke and Hume, who they actually look at that style. Even if they dislike some of the things he said, they look at his style and they go, wow, this is what we want to do to write more clearly and to get our ideas across more powerfully. And we're not going to copy the style of some of the ancients, and we're not going to copy the style of these other theological thinkers. We're going to use Bacon's style or some version of Bacon's styles. Second, so first stylistic. Second, it's hard to know how to organize these because he's got so much great stuff. But second, what he set out to do was also unprecedented with the Novum Organum and generally with what he was writing outside of his political context. And that is, he came up with the idea that what is philosophy, or natural philosophy as he called it, what came to be science, supposed to be doing? And up until this time, mostly what philosophy is supposed to be doing is allowing you to live a life that is less bad or maybe good relative to the world in which you find yourself, and or trying to prepare you for the afterlife. This would be sort of the ancient philosophers versus the theological philosophers. And those two main lines, which could be sometimes combined, of course, really had nothing to say too much about society in general, about application, about empirical results, all these sorts of things. And so it was really a radical break when Bacon steps forward, and this is from the Novum Organum, this is chapter 91. There's another powerful and great cause of the little advancement of the sciences, which is this: it is impossible to advance properly in the course when the goal is not properly fixed. But the real and legitimate goal of the sciences is the endowment of human life with new inventions and riches. Now, full stop. The goal of the sciences, the goal of natural philosophy, as I project it, is to improve human life and provide it with riches. Not to accept the world as it is, not to retreat from the world and do the best you can, not be a stoic and just do what you think is morally correct. It's not to get my life right so that in the afterworld I'll go to heaven and I won't suffer from hell, not to enrich myself, not to, all these other goals, not to gain power, but to improve the lot of humankind and to give it riches. Now, this is a radical break for several reasons, and it seems simple enough. Hey, notice how clear that is. Right? Let me repeat that so you get how clear he's writing. There's another powerful and great cause of the little advancement of the sciences, which is this: it is impossible to advance properly in the course when the goal is not properly fixed. Now, this is just a good idea. It's hard to get where you're going if you don't know where you're going, right? If you have a clear goal, much easier to make progress towards that goal. So, one clearly stated, he says the problem with the sciences is it had no clear goal. So I'm going to give you a clear goal. I'm going to say but the real and legitimate goal of the sciences is the endowment of human life with new inventions and riches. This is like a crazy new idea. One, he posits humankind, not the Catholic world, not the subjects of the king, not British subjects, not my friends. Much of the ancient Greek and Roman writing was very concerned with their friends. Not the empire, not trying to make my nation stronger or my country more fearsome. No, he invents this concept of humankind. Like there's this social world of people and that we should do something to help everybody. And that's a thing that can be done. I mean, this is such an incredibly ambitious vision to say, oh, let's imagine that that we're all together in this, and that therefore my goal as a thinker and a scientist should be to advance not myself, not my friends, not my community, all of humankind. This is in 1600. This is 400 plus years ago that Bacon is sitting around going, you know what I think? I think we should work to help everybody. And how do you help people? You help people by giving them new inventions, theoretically helpful inventions, and riches. So very earthly. In theory, the Catholic Church is trying to become universal and spread the gospel to everybody. But they didn't have the same notion of humankind, and what they were trying to give people at best was next worldly salvation. At worst, the domination by the Catholic Church today. So, sort of read that how you will. But it certainly wasn't this grandiose vision that had some sort of selfless notion of helping people on earth today live better, more rich, more interesting lives. And so the audacity of his vision just from the get-go, by the way, I say from the get-go, he implies this earlier in the Novum Organum, but that was chapter 91, where he actually gets around to stating it perfectly clearly. And so he says, the great crowd of teachers know nothing of this, but consist of dictatorial hirelings, unless it so happens that the new discovery, which is generally attended with loss of property, right? Unless it so happens that some artisan of an acute genius and ambitious fame gives up his time to a new discovery, which is generally attended with loss of property. The majority, so far from proposing to themselves the augmentation of the mass of arts and sciences, make no other use of inquiry into the mass already before them than is afforded by the conversion of it into some use in their lectures, or to gain, or to the acquirement of a name, and the like. So most people aren't trying to advance other people or humankind generally, something that basically Bacon sort of just posits anyway. He's just kind of making it up. But simply, okay, how much do I need to learn? I need to learn enough or improve something enough so that I can make money, or I can make a name for myself, or I can be, get curry court favor or whatever. So all this is fixed. So Bacon says, no. Now we need to move out of this. We need to get, make progress for everyone. So how do we do this? Well, that's the entirety of the Novum Organum. Unfortunately, we can't go through all of it. And he says another observation, this is very early on in the Novum, this is actually chapter 2. He says, the unassisted hand and the understanding left to itself possesses but little power. Effects are produced by the means of instruments and helps, which the understanding require no less than the hand. And as instruments either promote or regulate the motion of the hand, so those that are applied to the mind prompt or protect the understanding. Perhaps this is the first request for grant funding ever sent by a scientist to a government. Probably not the first. I'm sure there were earlier ones, but look, our understanding of our senses is very limited. What we need are instruments. We need technology to help us advance our understanding, to augment our senses, to clarify our senses, to check that our senses are giving us appropriate data. And we need both physical instruments that help the hand. That's what he's talking about. So, like a microscope. He's not saying microscope, of course, but like a microscope would be a classic example. And we need instruments of the mind. We need systems. We need logic. We need orders, so that we can use these instruments to augment our senses and our capacity to think, so that we can produce better results to the benefit of mankind. Now, if this narrative sounds familiar to you, it's because this is absolutely 100% the story that science has been telling us basically since Bacon's time, because it is this concept of, look, if we have time, if we have the capacity to research it, if we can think correctly, we think we can make the world a better place. And that notion, that hubristic ideal, comes in large part from Bacon. He was the champion. He was the articulator of this dream. And we've just run with it. Again, just the idea that the world could be improved is astounding. That we could make it better. That's not just given. It's not just fixed by God. It is actually something that can be upgraded. It can be changed, can be augmented for the better. All of that is newish, and all of this is really kinds of revolutionary thinking. So first, you have the problem of our senses are limited, but you have other problems. And this is where he starts to go, and he wants to attack all kinds of what's come before him. And again, this is why I chose the St. Thomas Aquinas, the Summa Theologica, as a starting point. You'll see why here in a second. It says, what interferes with our capacity to think? Well, the formation of notions and axioms on the foundations of true induction is the only fitting remedy by which we can ward off and expel these idols. And the idols are, he listed the problems of thinking. Formations of notions and axioms on the foundation of true induction. Now, deductive reasoning, of which you get a lot in Aristotle and other places, is nothing wrong with it per se. It's just really difficult to apply in the sciences because generally you have to do some experiments, you get some results, and you try to go, okay, can I draw broader, in this case, axioms from that? If the answer is yes, then I draw the broader axioms, and then I put those axioms to the test. And so it's this kind of endless cycle of testing and hypothesizing. And again, we're familiar with this because this is the process of science, but here it is. Here he's laying it out. But of course, there's many impediments to this. By far the greatest impediment and aberration of the human understanding proceeds from the dullness, incompetence, and error of the senses. So problem number one, our senses mislead us, and they aren't very refined. Hence, he wants the instruments, right? He's like, look, we can't see very well. If we could see better, we could learn more. Our sense of touch isn't very fine. We have a tough time guessing weight if we put stuff in our hands. If we have instruments, this can do better. Plus, our perceptions can mislead us in a number of ways. There's false perception, and then there's the notion that anything that if we counter, let's see, here we go. Since whatever strikes the senses preponderates over everything, however superior, which does not immediately strike them. Hence, contemplation mostly ceases with sight, and a very scanty or perhaps no regard is paid to invisible objects. So not surprisingly, we respond to the things that we can see much more powerfully than the things we can't see. Therefore, it seems like the things we can see are much more important than the things that we can't, even though this may not be the case all of the time. But he's just talking about there, here's a clear articulation of the limitation of the senses and how it misleads our mind. So one problem we have is the whole thing of sense perception, with which we're all familiar. Another set of problems, however, come from our common backgrounds, the way we're raised. And he says, the idols of the market are the most troublesome of all, those namely which have entwined themselves round the understanding from the associations of words and names. For men imagine that their reason governs words, while in fact words react upon the understanding. And this has rendered philosophy and the sciences sophistical and inactive. Words are generally formed in a popular sense and define things by those broad lines which are most obvious to the vulgar mind. But when a more acute understanding or a more diligent observation is anxious to vary those lines and to adapt them more accurately to nature, words oppose it. Hence, the great and solemn disputes of learned men often terminate into controversies about words and names, in regard to which it would be better to proceed more advisedly in the first instance, and to bring such disputes to a regular issue by definitions. So I mentioned this in an earlier lecture where I talked about socialism, and I said I dislike the use of the word socialism because generally it's either used to mean good or bad. That's all it is. And people generally have no concept of what they're talking about or any clear sense of what they mean when they say, oh, socialism. And so you get all these debates, quote unquote, political debates But they aren't really debates. They're just so much sophistry, because what I'm saying is my ideas are good and your ideas are bad. And then you say my ideas are bad and your ideas are good. And we use whatever words we want to associate with good and bad. And then there we have it. And Bacon's like, look, you can't, using language like this does not help. It just confuses. It just misleads. We have to agree on the definitions of the words we're using if we're going to have a meaningful debate. Otherwise, we're just involved in sophistry. And it turns out that a lot of the time, a shockingly large amount of the time, we're just doing that. We're just engaged in sophistry. And so one of the things that science has developed to be obsessed with is definitions. Like, how do we make sure we're testing the same thing, we agree on what we're doing, that we're using language in the same way? And science textbooks are filled with these glossaries where they try to define terms incredibly specifically, because that's what it's almost 100% of what they're doing is definitional. Like, hey, let's see if we can agree on what we mean by an organic compound. Let's see if we can agree on what constitutes a bacteria, right? Is this a bacteria or is this all of these things that seem so remote, but if you can come to a shared agreement about a definition, then you can make progress. But far, far too often, our discussions, our ideas are simply clouded by a lack of either clarity of the words we're using or indifference to the language that we're using. And so right from the get-go, from Bacon is like, look, we have to have much clearer definitions, and we have to agree on them, because otherwise we're just clouding our own thinking, we're clouding our reasoning. And again, if you look at Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, you'll see that he's just shifting, the language just shifts all over the place. You never know what the hell he's talking about, what his definitions are. I mean, they're all vague and moving. And again, you see this in lots of modern contemporary thinkers and talkers, particularly in the more public domain, who use language this way or misuse language this way, where they use vague definitions or misleading definitions of words so that it seems like they're saying one thing, they're really not, or it covers up all kinds of thinking problems. It's a very consistent problem that Bacon is there right from the get-go. And then he comes up with another set of problems, and this is, well, three actually, that he puts in one. A third set comes from, so you have, how do I want to go through this? Well, I won't read it. The quote's too long. I won't read the whole thing. But he basically says, there are therefore three sources of error and three species of false philosophy: the sophistic, the empiric, and the superstitious. And the first, the sophistic, is generally what he means by people who take too much regard for the ancient world and just argue from there. So, he says you pay too much attention to the old world, to the Greeks and the Romans, and you just create all these logical structures in which, you quote one old master, and if he says something, then you quote another one, and he's really throwing rocks at Aristotle. He liked some of Aristotle, by the way, but he did not like the modern Aristotelians who had come to dominate a lot of thinking on the continent. So he's really attacking that. And then he says, then you have the superstitious, by which he means theology. He said, from the faith and religious veneration introduced theology and tradition, the absurdity of some among them having proceeded so far as to seek and derive the sciences from spirits and genii. So you have this concept of like, oh, look, theology does not help you think scientifically. It doesn't help you think about natural philosophy, because you're just going on faith and tradition, which is the opposite of what we're trying to establish here. Now, he's not attacking religion, important to note, because one, that would be a good way to go to prison at the time or get your head cut off. Two, because he's just saying, he says, look, religion is a separate realm of thinking. I'm not interested in that. This is not how you think about it. I want to think about the sciences. I want to think about natural philosophy, and that doesn't have anything to do with religion. So he's kind of create this little separate land where we can make some progress on things and not be misled by religious thinking. And so he says, look, on one hand, you have theological thinking, which misleads us in all kinds of ways. And then you have the ancients and the sophistic thinking, which misleads us in all kinds of ways. And of course, you can see now why I started with Summa Theologica, because St. Thomas Aquinas is probably the most dominant thinker of the time, even in Bacon's time, one of the most prominent. His works were incredibly prominent and powerful. He's saying, look, it's wrong in both ways. Trying to combine two bad things doesn't make a good thing, it makes a worse thing. So we have to get rid of this reliance on the ancients. Not that they're all bad, you just can't use them the way we've been using them. You have to throw out the church. Get rid of that, right? Because this is not helping us. This is traditions and faith and religion, and that's not what natural philosophy should be doing. And then he has the third one, which you may be surprised here, which is the empiric. And the empiric, by this he meant people who are doing experiments. And the point he goes on to make at length in Summa Theologica is that most of the people who are doing experiments, A, are not educated, and B, they do one experiment, they get one result, and then they draw these incredible conclusions, right? You know, it's the classic black swan problem. If you only see white swans, then you say, okay, there can't be a black swan. If you drop a turtle into the street and it catches on fire, then you figure out that, well, turtles must be flammable. And this is the sort of extrapolation from too little data. And when experimentation is so rare and so unusual, most of the people who are carrying on experiments, often in the name of alchemy, were extrapolating whole systems of thought from one or two data points that they actually may have run sort of a vaguely decent experiment, but in such a poor intellectual environment, and then they extrapolated so many worlds from this one data point that is just crazy. This is another thing you see, by the way, to this day. All the time I see people quote one study or one piece of data or one outcome or one example, and they go ipso facto, this whole big world of thinking is solved or disproven or proven or whatever. And it's like, no, like Bacon was telling us you can't do that 400 years ago. You can't have one piece of data and try to extrapolate from that. So here's a guy in 1600 saying, look, we can't rely on the ancients. You can't stick with theology, and you really can't trust these people who are doing one or two experiments. So, and you go, wow, what does that leave, right? If you've gotten rid of all of that, which is basically everything that anybody had ever based philosophy on up to that point, with the exception of people who said, I'm the king, do what I say, or I'll cut your head off. And you had people who argued in favor of that. But, so philosophy really, particularly as an idea of natural philosophy and the study of nature, hadn't made much progress. So what does he recommend? He says, of all the signs, there's none more certain or worthy than the fruits of than that of the fruits produced. For the fruits and the effects are the surest vouchers, as it were, for the truth of philosophy. Now, from the systems of the Greeks and their subordinate divisions and particular branches of the sciences during so long a period, scarcely one single experiment can be culled that has a tendency to elevate or assist mankind. There you go. So what we need, going back to the beginning, is something that produces fruits. Of all signs, there's none more certain or worthy than that of the fruits produced. So if you produce fruits, if you have valuable outcome, then your philosophy is true. This is just new, really unique. I don't know if he's the first person to articulate this, but he's certainly the first person to articulate this in a big way. So what we need is a system of thinking whose truth or falsity is based on outcome. Period. It needs to be testable. It has to, if it produces something valuable that people like, it's true. Now, this is a weird assertion, particularly for 1600. This is like a bizarre assertion for 1600. But even today, we struggle with this because we say, oh, we want something to be right. Well, it has to be consistent. No, it doesn't have consistency. He doesn't say consistency. It has to be logically whole. Nope, he doesn't say anything about logically whole. It has to follow from the meaning of our sacred texts. He doesn't say anything about sacred texts. It has to come from the right people. Doesn't say anything about the right people. He says, if it produces good results that help mankind, that produce the riches, then it is true. This is, like I said, an incredibly different definition of truth. Essentially, it's a utilitarian definition of truth. And of course, empirical and utilitarian philosophy are coming very soon to a lecture series near you because of Bacon, because he just says, look, how make it useful if it has utility and produces fruit you're doing the right, your arguments are true. If not, your arguments are false. Whew. This is an amazing overthrow of the thinking systems of Europe for several, and not just Europe, all over the world, for several hundred, if not thousands of years, because it sets a measurable, even if we can argue about what counts as a good result or a valid contribution, but it makes it measurable and knowable. And this is a huge step forward. Then how do we do this? So one, he is very much in favor of experimentation. So the evil of not doing experiments, and this is the evil he's talking about here, the evil, however, has been wonderfully increased by an opinion or inveterate conceit, which is both vainglorious and prejudicial, namely, that the dignity of the human mind is lowered by long and frequent intercourse with experiments and particulars. There you go. So one barrier has been that there's been this bias against actually doing experiments with your hands, that thinkers, important people, people that matter, don't get dirty. Their hands don't get mucky. They think big thoughts in big rooms and produce, if anything, they get their hands a little inky by writing on the page. But that is the extent of what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to be in a laboratory, which really hadn't been invented yet, but you're not supposed to be out in the field collecting specimens or doing experiments with animals or measuring the rate of the flow of the River Thames or whatever it is that might actually contribute to human knowledge or human capacity and understanding. You're supposed to be thinking big thoughts by reading big books. And he's like, no, that's incredibly unhelpful prejudice. So one thing that he very, very strongly asserts is that you have to run experiments, because if you can't test it, then you can't know whether or not it's true or right. A next step in this, excuse me, is he says, look, you have to try and define everything as clearly as possible. There's a lot of the Novum Organum that talks in kind of, I must say, a confusing way about the need to define all the aspects of everything. You know, it's like, oh, we need to know its weight, its color, its texture, its size. Is it changing? Is it stable? How do we know it's changing or stable? This just vast catalog that we're supposed to know for everything, single thing. It's completely unworkable in the way that he points it out. But it's this notion of saying, look, we need this massive catalog of data about everything that we're dealing with. And then we have to focus on it very clearly. And so experimentation and then massive data collection. Like this, he wants to have as much data correlated in as easy a way to access as possible. He points out that just having data is not as helpful as it is having data that you can access and organize and use in a meaningful way. He realizes this is going to be a problem. He doesn't solve the problem. He just points out that this needs to be done. And then he says, okay, so we do all these experiments, we get this data, we're creating these huge, massive piles of information. And then he says we have to induct from this. Now, deduction is taken, where the conclusion must necessarily follow from the premises. That's the classic definition of deduction. But induction is an extrapolation. You say, okay, we have lots of evidence, we have lots of data. Now let's see if we can create a general theory or axiom from this that allows us to understand the world better. Because he says, look, just collecting data, just having a bunch of facts and figures and experiments, not going to do it. We then have to build models, essentially mental models, again, axioms, theorems, that, of course, you go on to test. It's the testability that he loves and is interested in. And so, in a nutshell, he lays out huge proportions of the scientific endeavor. He doesn't solve any of these problems, right? He doesn't tell us what are the good rules. He tries to tell you what the good rules for induction are. He never works this out. It's not clear that we have worked out what the best rules for induction are. Science is a very inexact science, oddly. He recognizes that you need things that you can test. Otherwise, you're just doing more of this pointless metaphysics. You're just in the land of sophistry. And he argues that you have to consistently guard yourself against superstition and the incorporation of ideas that just come from your culture rather than anything that's boiling up from evidence that you've actually researched or the data that has been collected from other people. essentially it reads like a 16th century or 17th century guide to careful thinking and the analysis of evidence. And what's amazing about this is it's at a time before basically anybody has really thought this through in this way, and he hits pretty much every major point. It's shocking how prescient it is, how much our culture of science has borrowed from him, and how much when we get science wrong, because I have a lecture on scientism about how we go wrong, Bacon actually warned us against those errors over and over and over again. He warned us about the problems of science that were coming because people were going to take this one too far. They're going to be too sophisticated, or they're going to rely on too little evidence, or he's talking about all these problems even before science really develops. And so it's just this incredibly foresightful and innovative collection of thinking processes that he wants us to go through for the improvement of mankind, which is the real revolution. The measure of the goodness of your philosophical system is, has it improved human existence? There you go. This is, even today, I think this is quite debatable. People say, well, I want to know something, what's true, what's right, what's good. And Bacon's answer, and I think a good one from the sciences, is those things that tend to improve human existence are true. Right? It's an interesting, it's sort of an interesting posit. It's not true in the eternal ontological sense, but true in the like, hey, this is the kinds of philosophical systems we should be building. So if you're helping people and improving the world, then your system is good. And we're going to give you a little true right there. We're going to say, oh, look at that. You cured polio. Let's give you some truth there. Your system is true because it cures polio. And you'll hear this people say, oh, science is just another mythological system. It is just another mythological system, but it is a mythological system that has this weird caveat to it. And the caveat is it has to produce results. And if it doesn't produce results, then the story's not true. And those results are measured in the degree to which they're able to improve human lives and or the riches of human existence. And that, having a little loop like that, a little feedback loop that says, oh, if this works, it's good. If not, then it's not good, is actually a really different kind. If you want to call it a mythology, of course, great. Now we're talking about the definitions of mythology. Again, right, there's a problem Bacon laid out for us. But he's okay with that as long as you go, okay, sure, a mythology, if that's how you want to define that, as long as you recognize that ours is a very different kind of mythology, because it has the step in it that says you have to verify it through the fruits, the outcomes, the goodness, the appeal, the riches that you've brought into the world. And this just extraordinary breakthrough for him to first imagine the existence of a humankind that could then be improved, and then to say, here's a method that I think could really improve the lives of humankind. And then for that method, however vaguely conceptualized by him, to actually bear the fruit that it did, and like, for instance, we can now feed the world, it's extraordinary. It's a truly extraordinary achievement. And again, if you can read it in comparison to what was being written at his own time and just before his own time, it is shocking. It is a shocking departure from what was going on around him. Again, just go read 20 pages of Summa Theologica, read 20 pages of Novum Organum. It won't take that much time, and you'll go, wow, right? This is a revolution, basically. And finally, and he comes back to this time and again, and I think this is crucial, and so I want to end on it, is he's not a totalizer. He keeps saying there's limits to human perception, there's limits to human understanding, there's limits to the capacity for us to make progress in any given amount of time. Therefore, this is not a total perfect system. We're not going to have all the information we want. Our inductions are not going to be perfect. Our conclusions will sometimes be flawed, if not often be flawed. We might get partial truth. And he makes this argument for the imperfect. Now, this is crucial because if you think about Plato's world of the perfect forms, one big model from the ancient world, Aristotle's repeated claims that he's created the total logic, another big claim for totalization, the church's arguments that we have the story from the God who tells us how things are, another totalizing, perfect, and that any errors or problems are part of human failing. This is what Plato says. Oh, humans are the problem. The universe is perfect. Humans are struggling. The church says, well, if you don't get this, this is your problem. God is perfect. You have a problem. Bacon sort of turns that around. And he says, no, let's embrace thinking systems that aren't total, that are flawed, imperfect, modest in some ways, subject to revision, revisiting, misunderstanding, retesting, falsification, verification. That this kind of bumbling, imperfect, perhaps changeable system is what we should be doing. We shouldn't be striving for perfection or totality or absolute knowledge. Those are certainly outside the realms of the natural sciences. This is or natural philosophy. He articulates this very clearly in many of the passages in Novum Organum. And as much as positing a humankind that can be in a world that can be improved and the riches can be amplified, creating a system and saying, look, it is not only okay, it's both good and necessary that our system is flawed, imperfect, subject to revision, that's a feature because this is how it should be. We need to accept that, work with that, make it part of the process. And so he unfreezes things. He says, we're not trying to stop. We're not trying to end things. We're not trying to come up with total, complete, perfect answers for all eternity, because he says that's pointless anyway. That's outside the realm of human capacity. He says we should be looking at the world as it is and trying to improve it for people as they are. And so both of the very strong tendencies towards utilitarianism, empiricism, and the sciences that come out of this period or the period that's to come in England and then the British Isles, and then it's spread all over the world, draw heavily on this single major work, although he wrote a bunch of other ones on related topics, but this is the big one, from this one person, and in its style and in its outlook is really an incredibly dramatic break from what was going on around him at a time. And so as we'll see moving forward, his concepts are quoted time and again. His outlook is referred to time and again, even when people disagree with it. So both in the clarity of his style, his desire for definitions, use of evidence, acceptance of inductive reasoning and its limitations, promotion of experimentation and data and record keeping and verification and falsification of results that can be revisited and falsified and verified at other times, all as a part of a human endeavor to improve the quality of the world and to make us richer is the profound legacy of Sir Francis Bacon. Thank you.